from some numbers. First thing we need to remember is what is an acre, how big is an acre, and luckily we have the American Gridiron football field is a spatial reference to what an acre is and how large an acre is. So that spatial reference or that visual reference to an acre is really important. If you're flying over a site in Google Earth or if you're flying over Google Maps, just look for an American football field as a reference to how many acres something might be. And if you grab a football field with trace paper, you can float it over a site very quickly and start to see how many acres a site might be, referencing an acre. So that equivalence is very helpful for us. Other things that planners put into a comprehensive plan relative to the size of an acre, number of units per acre, it then becomes something that a developer has to follow in order to apply for development review. I would like to build some buildings on this site. What does your city, township, town, village allow? And so it's these numbers that planners, municipal planners, write into a plan that developers have to follow in order to approach a development review. And those are controlled by a series of numbers that would then lead to a successful development application. For this town that we were working with JDO Consulting Group out of Omaha. This is a suburban town on the south side of the Kansas City Metroplex. They determined in their comprehensive plan how many acres they had, what land use they currently had those acres in, their anticipated 2035 development. Most comprehensive plans are 20 years or 25 years in advance. So they have an anticipated growth for the percentage or how many acres of those are going to be low density residential, medium density residential, office, retail, light industrial. They then determine potential residential dwelling units or commercial floor area based on that anticipated development and project a potential new population. So this type of population anticipation is a very typical process that is built into a comprehensive plan. And it's that potential population that helps you forecast the number of houses you're going to need, the number of schools you'll need, the number of grocery stores you want to attract, and other factors that come with that level of development. It's also how you can forecast your taxation and potential revenue. But for a town like this that is anticipating growth, which is fairly typical for the American landscape, we still have very much a growth mindset. It's these types of numbers that start to forecast the potential residential dwelling units or commercial floor area that leads into their anticipated land use. We're also governed by a couple of other numbers. One is floor area ratio, and the other is dwelling units per acre. Two additional numbers that are written into plans that developers have to follow when they are applying to develop property are FAR and dwelling units per acre. FAR is graphically represented if we assume that a one-story building is filling an entire lot with 100% lot coverage. That is an FAR of 1 to 1. Floor area ratio of 1 to 1. That almost never happens though, because you have other things like parking and runoff and stormwater and setbacks that you want to factor in. But a two-story building on half of that lot would also be an FAR of 1 to 1. A four-story building on a quarter of a lot would also be an FAR of 1 to 1. So you can achieve an FAR of 1 to 1 with multiple ways in terms of how tall the building is and how much lot coverage it is. But in suburban development, the FARs are very, very low. So based on what's in the plan, a land use assumption that a floor area ratio of commercial except downtown is a 0.25. This is now assuming that all commercial development in this town from that moment forward will never be more than 1 story on a quarter of the lot. That gives you suburbia, doesn't it? No building shall be more than 25% 1 story over that gives you a floor area ratio of 0.25. Now look at these numbers here. 0.25 for all of these different things. Commercial downtown, office, industrial light, industrial heavy. Heavy goes down even further. 0.05 lot coverage. So big buildings, big lots, but typically one story. So that these types of numbers do not suggest density. They suggest a suburban model of development for this particular area. The other number is dwelling units per acre here. But population per dwelling unit, we're assuming that the single family house is 2.7 children or 2.8. The fact is in the United States that number is going down. The number of single people living in suburban homes is going up, and as our child population is in fact going down. In multifamily situations, it's approximately 2. But it's what's astounding for home builders and for developers and planners is understanding now the number of single people living in suburban detached homes is going up. So that just creates more sprawl, not less. So those options are making challenges for us. The other number is dwelling units per acre. Remember, an acre is the size of an American football field, roughly. So think about your high school football field, think about Ball State's football field. And just imagine now numbers of houses sitting on that football field. Residential estate for this town will be 0.5 to 2 dwelling units per acre. So a residential estate lot, a rural estate lot, the type where you spend 7 hours on a Saturday mowing lawns, can be anywhere from 2 football fields large to half a football field, if you have numbers like 0.5 to 2. So for residential estate land use, 2 houses per football field. It's a big lot, right? A lot of lawn mowing. What they consider to be low density, 1 house per football field up to 4 houses per football field. What they consider to be low to medium, 4 to 9, medium to high in this town outside of Kansas City, no more than 15 dwelling units on a football field. That's relatively low density when we look at the rest of the world. Okay. But that is on par with what we consider to be normal residential development in the United States. Okay. One of our grad students who is graduating next month put these graphics together to also illustrate the different factors that determine what our built environment looks like. Lot size, lot width, size of yards, percentage of lot coverage, the floor area ratio, and the building height. These are all things that comprehensive planning and, in particular, design guidelines help planners, urban designers, and landscape architects legislate, and that architects and developers have to interpret and follow. So all these factors lead into the built environment that you experience every day. And just by manipulating those factors, you get either more dense environments or less dense environments. Flip now over to more urbanized districts. You're looking at in mixed-use districts or in higher density districts. Now think River North in Chicago, think West Loop in Chicago, right? Think downtown Ann Arbor, think some of the infill going into Fort Wayne. 3.0 base floor area ratio, 6.6 max floor area ratio. So at minimum, you have at least 3 stories with full lot coverage on an urban lot, minimum. Max 6.6, 6.5 stories on a full urban lot. Now, what city in the United States has an average of 5 to 6 stories consistent throughout the city? Washington, D.C. has a height restriction. So that's why Washington, D.C. has a consistent urban pattern. Nothing shall be taller than right. Capitol Hill is already on a hill. So the capital, the top of the spire of the Capitol and Washington Monument are the governments. Nothing shall be taller than that. What you get is a city that's consistent with 5 to 6 stories. The Napoleonic Code by Balthazar Neumann, legislated no more than 6 stories. Now, the cornice line of the building, shall be at 6 stories. And then you have the Parisian roof, which they figured out how if you barreled the roof or you mansarded the roof, you could get another residential unit up there because it was past the cornice. That's where we get our Parisian roof and our mansard roofs and our barrel roofs. Because the cornice line is consistent, but they were able to get 4 units on the top of the penthouse. So the Napoleonic codes legislated a 6-story limit to the cornice, and that's what gives Paris its consistency. It's because of height restriction. So this type of urban infill that we often use follows this general notion of a 3 floor area ratio of 3 with a max of 6.6. So approximately 6 or 6.5 stories, full lot exposure. Look at the land uses though, right? Retail on the bottom floor, possibility of a mixture of office on the 2nd and 3rd floors, residential above that. So to achieve some really vibrant mixed-use districts, you want to mix up your land uses. Other ways to do it, retail on the bottom floor, residential tower, and an office tower sharing on the same block. And those different massings can actually start to add some character. What we're doing probably in Evanston now and in River North Chicago is ground floor retail, several floors of parking, right? An active recreational roof, office, and then either hotel or residential above that. So what you often see in River North and Chicago, north of downtown, are residential towers on top of podiums that might be a mixture of parking, retail, or office. And so that's what you often see now. Places like Midtown Atlanta, River North Chicago, Cincinnati, and the like. So there is an explosion in residential demand in more vibrant mixed-use districts. COVID has changed that to some extent because we anticipate that anywhere from 10 to 30% of the workforce will never return to the office, will remain at home. And so that will add more demand on suburban retrofitting and suburban home plan renovations to accommodate the work at home environment and create more interesting experiences that are closer to the work from home environment. So that will change everything. Massing vocabulary, we do tend to build this ziggurat or the stacked block kind of look is pretty common. Okay, this comes all the way back to the New York City Building Code of 1909, which legislated that you will step back a building as it goes up to allow more daylight penetration to the street. Otherwise, you get a canyon effect and everything is cold and everything is wet and everything is dark all the time. So this stepping is practical for a couple of reasons. Most of your people are on the main floors, the first floors. Your less densely populated areas go up and are able to be accommodated by stairs and elevators. And by stepping the building back, you get the double effect of additional wind, light, and fresh air penetrating to the street. So these things have been with us for years in terms of how design guidelines go together. What's happening though is that there's more demand for more interesting things happening on the street wall. And so folks are writing into very stringent design guidelines, material, color, articulation, massing, detailing, to make the street experience more interesting. When in fact, they might all be one building, but it looks like 12. And so sometimes that can lead to ridiculousness. But what we found is that even though it might be one full block or half block, if you can articulate a more interesting variety of things at the street level, it will pass and be accepted by the public and by your municipal planners. So you see examples of things like this, where there might be a uniform residential tower rising out of a variety of colors and materials at the street level. And then we go from there. Office buildings typically have a core, or they may have a
double loaded corridor, common core of services, plumbing, elevators and stairs. Retail buildings typically have a front entrance and a back entrance. The back for service, storage, and waste. The front for control points for checkout and guest services. Industrial buildings, fairly straightforward. Factory floor, storage floor, management, other circulations. Residential buildings, whether they be single loaded corridors or double loaded corridors, a corridor linking between elevator and stair, apartments on either side, very typical for dormitory buildings, hotel buildings, and the like. But we are less dense than most of the world. So the rest of the world lives much denser than we do. So if we look at suburbia as 1 to 3 density units per acre, 1 to 3 dwelling units per football field, then just pushing the envelope of what we consider to be density does get us back into our 17th to 19th century neighbors, but it still doesn't get anything close to Manhattan or Hong Kong. It's very, very different, very different fabric than what most folks are used to. By the way, if typical suburbia, this would be Johnson County or Hamilton County, that level right there still doesn't get you above 4 to 6 dwelling units per acre. And every house is the same, by the way, too. The floor plan might be flipped. The roof is all the same. You might get to pick the brick color for your front facade, but there are entire neighborhoods, as you know, where all of the post boxes are the same. Lot of different sameness, but when you get into Brooklyn, Montreal, older Chicago neighborhoods, the row house starts to give you more flexibility because you can achieve now 12 density units per acre, all the way up to 20, 25 density units per acre, depending on how you split a row house up. Is a row house a single family house, or is there an apartment in the basement, or is there an apartment in the carriage house at the alley? Are there accessory dwelling units that you can add to a row house? The row house, the 19th century row house, ends up being very, very flexible for adding density to a neighborhood. Now, it won't achieve New Delhi. But this is, in fact, one of the wallpapers I use on my phone. But yeah, that's all buildings. So that's 100 density units per acre, as opposed to what we're used to. And then even in China, they are experimenting with what they consider to be low density, but we're still looking at the edge suburbs of Shanghai. There's a football field right there. You can use as a reference. You're still achieving 30 to 50 density units per acre, which is 2, 3, 4, even 10 times the density of the United States suburb. And then there's other factors like water, right? We have pretty high water table in parts of Indiana. So you end up working around that, and your density is also dealing with lots of stormwater runoff or wind or really wet ground. So we typically then don't achieve more than 6 density units per acre, even what we consider our more crowded suburbs. One factor, though, where cities have been able to really look at redensification, adding more downtown residents, is in older waterfronts or old ports or old river ports, areas which were formerly industrial zones, which are no longer safe or no longer able to accommodate the types of trade, container ships or the like. We just had a container ship stuck in the Suez Canal, as you know, for a couple of weeks, and that held up over 250 ships trying to get into the Mediterranean. So we see that factor, but there, container ships get bigger, then older ports become obsolete. And those older ports are typically close to downtowns, which gives you an opportunity to redensify and add vibrant new neighborhoods. So just a few of the places I've been. These are the Dublin Docklands in Dublin, Ireland. This is a theater by Daniel Libeskind. This is a park by Martha Schwartz. And U2's studios are right there, so they record all their albums right there. But there was an opportunity in their old docklands or their old port in this portion of Dublin to redensify and add a significant number of housing units to make it a more dense mixed-use neighborhood. So do check out that theater by Daniel Libeskind and that park by Martha Schwartz. This was a warm, warm July day, which is rare that it's not raining in Dublin. But this type of housing, retail and restaurant and office in the main floor, dense units above, higher priced units at the top, senior units, very interesting how they incorporated senior living units, have a street entrance off to the side so that seniors are not going up steps or elevators. So handicap accessibility and senior living, they take advantage of the side alley or the side street entrance to accommodate for senior living units and handicap units, which was a plus. It was a really interesting thing that they did in this particular development, which then allowed the more prominent waterside face to be restaurants, cafes, but the side entrance would accommodate all the senior living. Hamburg, a medieval city. You can see where their old wall was. So the core of the medieval city there. Their old port was obsolete because the size of container ships kept going up. Right? Container ships get bigger, and so the old port, which is a very important port for penetrating trade into the heart of Europe, down the Elbe River from the North Sea. Hamburg is a very important shipping and trade area with lots of sailors and lots of military. That's why the Beatles played there, was to entertain all of the different sailors and naval personnel that would inhabit Hamburg. But their old port is right next to their downtown, and when that old port was no longer sufficient, it moved out towards the North Sea as the container ships got bigger. Hamburg saw an opportunity to add 25% more area to their downtown. Now, how many cities get an opportunity to do that? To add 25% more area by reclaiming the old port. So there was design competitions and master plan competitions, and it leads to one of the more interesting urban housing experiments probably in the Western world. As well as some really aggressive and progressive landscape architectural projects around the old docks and providing all these amazing outdoor spaces and amenities for the new apartment dweller residents. And then apartment buildings that look like container ships or cruise liners, some fun references to naval architecture, all the different different amenities there. It kind of looks like a ship coming in. But also a lot of interesting climate change mitigation or climate change resilience thinking. The idea that this entire neighborhood could accommodate a 6-foot sea level rise was really both intriguing and also very disturbing because here's an example of, we know this is going to happen, so we're going to plan for it. And that's really like, wow, you know, how many of us would really go that far to say that the entire neighborhood could be flooded? Which could. And that the landscape architecture is designed specifically around that sea level rise and then that fall. So you've got these really interesting retention walls and pervious paving and drainage channels and the like. So the idea is that this entire neighborhood could be flooded if necessary, if climate change and sea level rise were to happen at that level of an aggressive pattern. So essentially, the first floor is floodable. So but it also adds lots of opportunities for people spaces at the same time. Hamburgers, so funny to say that, but they are used to apartment dwelling, and so they reach that density of 6.6 floor area ratio, or that almost 7 floor area ratio. Typical height of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 6.5 stories, with some opportunities for signature architecture. The firm of Herzog and de Meuron did the Elbe Philharmonic Hall, which is a signature building that sort of caps off one side of the dock. German cities always have a design center, public design center, which communicates all of the planning goals and the progress of those goals in a public setting. Very interesting way of communicating architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning to the public. So there is, every German city of this size will have a model, and the planners will make the model with the anticipated development, and then as each building is completed, the architect will bring in a perfectly laser-cut model of the project and place it in the model. So you can see the progress on the model communicating as the buildings are completed. So it's a really interesting form of public participation for y'all to investigate. The white is existing. The white is anticipated. The brown, the wood is all completed. So you can see just from the material of the model what is anticipated and what is completed. So there's a real partnership between the architecture firms, the public planning authority, to communicate the progress of the entire project. Java Island and Amsterdam. This is another docklands area that was reclaimed for housing. The urban design firm that did this was called West 8. They're based out of Rotterdam. The Dutch don't like apartments. Not in their culture to live in apartments. They prefer an address. They prefer attached row houses. So this was a bit of a stretch for them to push density even beyond the dense character of Dutch cities. And it's because of their aversion to apartments. They would much rather have a connection to the sky, a connection to the ground as an individual address. So it's not in their culture to live in apartments, but it is in the culture of a lot of the new immigrants coming to Amsterdam to live in apartments. So there is that mixture, and what ends up happening is that apartments end up being an affordable starter home or immigrant housing solution to the number of guest workers that flood into Amsterdam every single year. This building is called the Whale, appropriately. Okay. And the higher priced units are on the corner that help subsidize the affordable units in between. So some creative financing is used there in terms of how rents and leases help subsidize social housing, but still mixing it together into signature architecture so it doesn't look like social housing. It doesn't look like affordable housing. So some creative stuff there. But most of the development are row homes, again, because of that Dutch tendency to want to have their own address. Other innovations, though, which we found really interesting, these are garages now, but they can be quickly retrofitted into storefronts. And that was built into the design guidelines so that if the density did reach a certain point where shops and restaurants could come into the neighborhood, that first floor of the house could be easily retrofitted into a storefront or shop front. The residents at the time when we were there with students in 2006 were quite content to have them as garages, though. So, but that kind of built-in thing is an interesting innovation there. And then there are these wonderful bridges. And in the wealthier parts of the development, it's one architect per household. So there's variety as opposed to sameness. Most Dutch are happy living in a block of houses that have some commonality because it's still their house and their address. But there was one line of homes that were one architect per client. So there was that mixture of incomes happening there too. The Dutch don't need a yard, but they do like a porch or a front stoop and or a small roof deck or courtyard. They're satisfied with that. And then they bike everywhere, as you know, to their public parks and large open spaces. But there was one line in this development of wealthier homes, right? 3-story homes, and there was one architect per client. So it created some more variety in the neighborhood as opposed to all of these houses being the same way. Canary Wharf in London. This was an industrial area in East London in the 1970s and 80s, started to reclaim and redevelop this area in the early 80s. This is Millennium Dome over here by Richard Rogers. The Olympic site for the London Olympics is just to the north. But this was billed as an opportunity for London to build a more consistent financial center similar to Wall Street in New York. So this old portion of Docklands, what we call the London Docklands, is now the London Stock Exchange and a large, bustling financial center. The master plan is by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, as well as a couple of the buildings that are there. But also still retrieving or still keeping some of the industrial grit of what the area used to be. The Jubilee line was a new tube extension that goes all the way to the Millennium Dome. This station was done by Norman Foster. Other ways to visualize density, we have an affordable housing database that is old and out of date, but it's helpful for us to visualize what this means. So this is Muncie and Anderson. This was the Muncie Urban Design Studio Affordable Housing Initiative through the 80s and 90s, led by Professor Costello. These single-family detached homes, typically 2 to 3 bedroom, 1.5 bath, reaches 6 density units per acre. So 6 houses on a football field. Chicago affordable homes, typically 2 to 3 story or 2.5 story, reach 20 density units per acre. So again, the Chicago-style row house does achieve a level of density that's really, really sustainable for supporting schools, grocery stores, and parks, and the like. So a good reference back to how the row house can do that. This is now this is California-style courtyard housing, very similar to Parisian-style courtyard housing or Madrid-style courtyard housing. This type of housing here has variety in it. Studio apartments, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, 4 bedroom. But because they're all put together like Tetris blocks, you don't know what is an affordable unit and what is not. The architecture blends all together. You don't know where the affordable apartments are, where the wealthy apartments are. That type of blending happens by very creative stacking of things, like Tetris, right? Like stacking Tetris blocks. But in an example like that, you don't know where the affordable housing units are. But you do know where the senior living units are because they're on the first floor. The disabled and senior living units are on the first floor, and they guard and rule the courtyard. That's called defensible space. There's one way in, one way out. So the neighborhood claims the courtyard, and that becomes a defensible space even in areas that experience crime. So these are important examples. With this level of what I call Parisian density, 1, 2, 3, 4 stories plus, you can achieve 66 density units per acre, which is pretty good considering the lower density of suburban homes. So courtyard style housing with a variety of different units stacked together creatively can achieve 66 density units per acre. Example of a charrette we did up in Topeka, just south of Mishawaka. Rural community, about 300 people, lots of industrial land and industrial facilities centered around Ford and Stearns watercraft, as well as the RV industry. So lots of these towns in northern Indiana have a lot of jobs, a lot of Amish around the community owning a good portion of the developable land. And Amish land is not sold, it is sent down through the generations, typically to the eldest son. So the eldest son in an Amish family will inherit that land and will maintain it as a farm. The other sons all have to go to work. So they work in the RV industry, the boating industry, the manufactured home industry. And they all charge their cell phones at work and things like that. Anyway, I stood on this intersection here in the middle of that town on Friday afternoon. And there were At that moment, like 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there were more bikes on the road than cars, first of all. Okay. Horses and carriages are getting more and more expensive to maintain. So the Amish are adopting bikes as a missing link. Number 2, I heard 4 languages on the ground. In this little town in northern Indiana, 4 languages. English, Mexican Spanish, Central American Spanish, and Arabic. All of the variety of workers that were working in Ford, Stearns, watercraft, and manufactured housing industry here. So our towns are more diverse than we think. So we looked at a possible 25-year planning scenario for anticipated growth. We calculated how many acres we would need based on 4 density units per acre, 6 density units per acre, and 8. We developed a diagram, and Professor Race, Bruce Race, handed me a diagram and said, I would like a site plan in 60 minutes, please. Full site plan, fully illustrated, 60 minutes, you have 1 hour to go. It took me 90 minutes. But he was relatively satisfied. It's a combination of diagram and site plan. So you can see the different densities here. So I laid this thing out with the markers in 90 minutes. We've got neighborhood parks, we've got tree-lined streets, we've got a commercial node here in the middle, and we have an extension of their schools. So because if we were to anticipate 1,000 new residents, you can support an elementary school with that. So we've got 4 density units per acre, 6, so smaller lots, and then even attached housing at 8. So that was a real charrette. At the end of it, I was obviously physically and mentally exhausted, but he said, congratulations, you know how to charrette. But he also reinstated that he wanted the site plan in 60 minutes, not 90 minutes. Other examples come from the Urban Land Institute. We have several books downstairs that have development examples for you to look at. So ULI publishes these manuals, so they have wonderful examples of site plans and data for you to look at. All the land use colors are represented in this one here. So this is big box retail here, civic use here with this little city hall. This is a transit node somewhere in California, done by Calthorpe Associates. Retail on the ground floor and apartments above. So using the different land use colors to communicate intention for this transit node somewhere in Central Valley, California. Another one, Richmond Transit Village in Richmond, California. This is by Calthorpe Associates. They are out of Berkeley. So looking at a typical transit node for a light rail vehicle. We've got the drop-off loop. This is very important in suburban transit-oriented development. We've got parking garage here, and then a drop-off loop. That's where one spouse or a family member drops off somebody to get the train, and then they loop out. Very typical for the DC Metro stations as well. So cars can come in, quickly drop off people and or pick them up and then come back out again. The DC Metro calls it the kiss and drop off lane. I'm not sure why they still call it that, but maybe it's from a different era. At any rate, we have row homes as well as some commercial and retail uses on the ground floor, civic uses on the corner here. But the idea that we create enough density to support the justification of this as a transit stop while adding parks and open space as well as retail and restaurant amenities for all these residents extending through the transit network. Working with Sustainable Communities Institute, Scott's company, in the early stages of the MADJAX project, we had to take a look at all the different lots that were part of the Cintas building. It was in fact several lots, several properties linked together. We did an illustrative site plan to show the future of the entire site, including the 2 additional buildings to the side. This is a former Studebaker dealership. This is the Cornerstone Center for the Arts. This was the anticipated Cornerstone Park. This is a bike parking garage and solar field for electric cars. And then we were really interested in a brewery or distillery on the corner, and then roof terrace for all the artist studios in the upper floor. Really also a desire to link the Muncie Arts and Cultural Trail through this portion of Madison Street so that Cornerstone and Mad Jack's would be serviced by it. We were not successful in that, but maybe we'll see what happens with the long-term development of the Muncie Arts and Culture Trail. But this was the initial vision for Mad Jack's in terms of how Scott was leading the effort to convert the former Cintas laundry facility into makerspace. This was my initial drawing, lots of solar panels, lots of roof terraces, brewery tanks, beer garden, solar charging area here, and then the Muncie Arts and Culture Trail running along Madison, linking these different cultural institutions. And of course, this is where we're at. It's still a work in progress. It's lots of different projects being done there in terms of some site development, facade, and additional building spaces being fleshed out as we go along. Other examples, smaller parks that I've worked on. This is in Derry, Pennsylvania. They love to call their town the Derry area, which is hilarious. But a mixture of site plan and diagram language, I guess, but all rendered in Photoshop. So if you're pulling an all-nighter like I did for this, there is hope for you that with 2 line weights, a scanner, and Photoshop, you can quickly put together a site plan. So and then label it. So just an example of how faster technology examples can come together. DTJ is a multidisciplinary firm that hires a couple of Ball State graduates. Do keep them in mind as you're thinking about employment. They do wonderful site plans for a lot of the mixed-use development in the West. Of course, these take hours, but very detailed. Gooding Clancy out of Boston, a large urban planning, urban design firm that do campus planning, corporate planning. This is Dublin, Ohio, north side of 275 Loop in Columbus, Ohio. Large suburban community that never had a downtown. So they wanted to see the opportunity they could knit a downtown together from nothing. So this is a 20-year, maybe 50-year anticipatory plan. Purple is light industrial. The yellow is all multifamily housing. Red is retail. Follows all of the land use colors. But this is hand drawn on a Wacom Cintiq tablet and then rendered in Photoshop. So it's that tradigital. For those of you looking at traditional and digital methods, this type of plan has a lot of detail in it, obviously. All these different trees and paths and bridges and intersections, all drawn by hand on a Wacom tablet and then rendered in Photoshop. But you can tell it's hand-drawn, right? There's enough of a wiggle there that it has that hand-drawn look, but it's I think further that much more readable in terms of Photoshop. To give you an idea of the scale of this anticipated development, this right here, this urban block would be the size of the Village Promenade in Muncie. So just equivalent of that donut style development with the parking garage in the middle and all of the upper floor housing and retail around it, just to give you an idea of how big and how much development they're anticipating here. Other students who graduated and passed through the program, Dallas Wirtz. This was a project for a BLA studio in North Tillotson to redevelop the 80 acres there north of Scheidler. Took him over a week to draw this. He did it. He did it. So some really aggressive work there. Other drawing styles may show phase construction. This is from the Sprawl Repair Manual to show how a big box retail site that has failed might be phased through time to have more mixed uses. The plan for Seaside, those of you familiar with Seaside, the original plan was done in watercolor. They chose primarily to just illustrate building and landscape. No land use is included in that, but this was the original drawing for Seaside. Other examples, this is a book by Thomas Wang, who was one of the design principals for Sasaki Associates in Boston. And if you just page through some of these older books, their site plans are just beautiful, really beautiful plans. So that integration of path and building and landscape and shadow are just really, really rich drawings. And so following on some of the traditions and some of the early techniques that we taught y'all in first year, right? The landscape techniques of shade and shadow, of topographic grading, of different conifer and deciduous species. And then sometimes really soft color just coming together. These plans are just so rich to look at. More local examples, Photoshop and SketchUp, and then backtracking, and maybe, I'm not sure what happened here, but they backtracked and they did a site plan by hand, just to illustrate some of the long-term goals of the site, the Kitzelman site. This is on the east side of Muncie. And then other folks that I follow on Instagram, Bats Michael, some of his drawings that are typically done in Morpholio or in Procreate on the iPad. Still uses a lot of trace paper too. Lead 8 is a Korean landscape architecture firm doing a lot of sketching and drawing on the iPad. This one all marker. Wessel van Dijk is an urban designer out of South Africa. Also using, I believe this is using Procreate for the iPad. Not that, but some of his more recent work. Cosmopolitan Design. Cassidy McCoe is out of North Carolina, lead designer for a landscape architecture firm, I think in Raleigh, but some wonderful drawings on their account. And he's using the Concepts app for the iPad. So that idea of thin layers of trace being built up in the iPad and then using the Apple Pencil to build up that. Craig Sklenar works for a firm in Montreal. He is a Ball State graduate, originally from Columbia City, Indiana. He worked in the city of Evanston for a while, did his master's over in Denver, and now has been with Stantec International, which is a firm out of Edmonton, and he's been working in their Ottawa and Montreal offices for the last few years. So he was part of our lecture series a couple of years ago. So if we look at UDA's methods, they're one of the things they specialize in, and it's another thing that you can specialize in, is military housing. Military housing is typically multifamily housing or attached housing. It's much denser than suburban housing, and so it's a great subgenre of practice for you to take a look at. There's firms that specialize just in military housing itself. So if we take a look at their block guidelines, we have them printed out for you here. So you establish the guidelines using your scale. This is approximately at 1 inch equals 30. We'll establish the trees. So with a circle template, we'll lay out the trees. Then on the second overlay, we will outline the trees with a thicker pen. Then the buildings. Then the roof lines. And then the blocks. Until you have this completed drawing with 2 line weights, trees and buildings outlined as such. Their color system goes a little bit further than most folks do. They use different greens to illustrate public land, the park in the middle, the public front of the houses versus the private backyards. We don't need to go that far, but it's just helpful to note that it's in their practice to illustrate the public or private nature of open space in their plans. So that's their practice. See how the front yard is a different green than the backyard, and that the public park is a different green than everything else. We don't need to go that far, but that it's helpful to remember that they are using those greens to illustrate the different publicity of different land versus another. So their finished plans look something like this. They use gray for their shadows. We can use We can use gray, we can use black, we can use blueberry, whatever we choose to do. Some of the examples that we've done over the years in the class look something like this, to this, to that. There's a corner commercial node there, as opposed to housing. We've done some mixed use as well here on the street. But our drawing process will look something like this. And then we'll add the shadows and color pencil. Okay, that's what we'll do. Let's take a break, come back, and we'll draw. Okay, I've surmised that this is approximately at 1 inch equals 30. So if you have your engineering triangle, engineering scale, those things are jiving for us. We've got a rear vehicle loop that might have on-street parking on it. We've got an island here that serves as a public park with a playground. We've got attached housing, quadplex and duplex variety here. And in past years, we've put some commercial on this street here. We've actually modified the plan to make this either commercial or mixed use up here at the street. So just to add more spice and variety to the exercise itself. So it involves some potentially manipulation of the street face here to incorporate some on-street parking or even some rear parking. Luckily, your future will have different discussions about parking minimums versus parking maximums as we approach autonomous vehicles and a variety of different modes. But at any rate, some things we can do to modify the exercise to make it more interesting is to start to think of these buildings in the front here being mixed use. So that means our tree cover here, we look at, take a 30 scale and put it next to a circle template, means that we're looking at a tree cover of 15 feet at ½ inch, all the way up to tree cover of 22, 23 feet at ¾ inch. So I'll mark those, if I don't break my pencil that is, so I can mark those with my pencil right on the template. Nice how these marks will hold on the template there. Larger trees might even be, more mature tree might be in the realm of 25 feet, so that's 25 to 30 feet. That would be the 1 inch circle. So for a more mature tree, for the most part, my street trees are going to be in the realm of ½ inch to 5/8 to 3/4. So I will pick those circles and then start to develop some quick guidelines for those. Placing trees in rows. An opportunity perhaps for some larger trees later on, assuming that they'll grow. Larger shade trees or canopy trees. For the most part, though, I want to keep them in the realm of ½ inch to 5/8. Those are street trees bordering the development. Ah, losing so much lead here. Now, making some modifications to this, we want to bring in some parking, maybe on this street here. We want to think about 12 or 15 feet deep parking. We want to bring in a lane here. These are going to be some additional variations we can bring into the plan. That would be approximately a 12-foot lane, or about half an inch. I could bring in make this sort of center building, that would make that a bit of an island. So it could maybe be a small restaurant or an ice cream shop or something like that. Parking then would be there. The park would still be here. But we can take the guidelines for the plan, we can start to mix it up and modify it a little bit. So some on-street parking here, maybe some parallel parking there. Try to make it a little bit different. Maybe get some mixed use going on in this plan. So those are just some of the modifications I make on this first overlay as I'm laying in the trees. I grab the opportunity here to enliven and add variety to the plan so it's not all residential. Maybe we could start to imagine this as a neighborhood node or a village node or something which is walkable to a lot of other residences. As we look at redensifying the suburbs or retrofitting the suburbs, the concept that is happening in urban design circles right now is the concept of the 15-minute city. It's something which the city of Paris is going to start to aggressively legislate in its planning and urban design guidelines. The idea that every resident of Paris is within 15 minutes of essential services. Groceries, beverages, schools, healthcare. A lot of this is born out of the pandemic. France is in its 4th lockdown right now. Its 4th national lockdown. So this notion of having services close to your address, things that you can walk to, is really critical. Other things that we can add to this portion of the plan, we can see a garage right here. We might add more garages to that. Those would include a curb cut. If you want to add more garages or playhouses or the like, those are things we can add with additional small curb cuts. These larger buildings are probably quadplexes. The smaller buildings might be duplexes. So we can add more garages to this. And we can see those referenced on the reference image as well. We can start to sketch out maybe the character of a little formal garden here. And think of this more as a playground or even a 2-stage playground. Multi-age playgrounds are a thing now, right? Playgrounds for younger children, playgrounds for older children. There's even in elder care and senior living situations, there are even playgrounds for the elderly now, so that folks will do different exercise, different muscle groups to keep them. It's so critical for folks in elder care and senior living assisted living to continue to exercise key muscle groups so that they are still able to feed themselves as they reach their needs. So play is another way of sustaining elder care, exercise, and muscle. You may be familiar with different exercise stations that are now part of cross-training circuits, or even part of jogging or running circuits. Different small pavilions that support chin lifts or different stair steps, things like that. We have a couple of those in Muncie. Unfortunately, our Rotary Club in Muncie installed them all together in one line. Not remembering that you're supposed to space them out further, but anyway. Running trails, walking trails, greenways, adding those little exercise stations can be good things to add. And so playgrounds then can become destinations for multiple ages, not just one or two ages. So garages. And I'll start to flesh out what each building is. I'm going to say that's a building. Start making some of those decisions here. It's not a lot of detail in the rough out, but it's very similar to what you might receive from a design principal. They'll hand you a very rough plan and say, here, flesh this out. I was working in the architecture industry. My boss would do a line drawing, a very simple line drawing to scale of an elementary school layout or a high school layout. Just a single line drawing. He would calculate it with a calculator and a scale on a piece of trace, hand it over and say, all right, we need full CAD of this by tomorrow. So it's that type of interpretation of simple line drawings that can then lead to the site plan drawing, whether it be an illustrated site plan drawing or even full CAD. So I'll just flesh in what is going to become a full building. One of the things the firm I worked for would do is go after bond issues. So they would do schematic floor plans of all of the community schools, all the buildings that they could add on to or renovate. So we would need these very presentation style, preliminary style floor plans. Not fully rendered, but color coded, fully rendered. So principals were headed out the door one day, I think at 3 o'clock. So when I got there at 8 o'clock in the morning, I had 8 to 3 to do presentation style floor plans of 6 buildings in that 6-7 hour period. And so these are the types of things where the charrette graphics techniques can come in handy, because if a principal or something is headed out the door at a certain hour, you may have only a few hours to put together presentation style drawings that can convince a client to hire the firm. So that one day was quite memorable. When I got everything done and printed out on transparencies, because they were going to be presenting on an overhead projector at the community meeting. And when they left, all the principals finally left the office to head to the job meeting, to the public presentation. I laid my head down on the desk of the cubicle, and I just remember one vein on this side of my head throbbing. And as my boss is leaving the office, he said, "Get that kid a hamburger or something." And then they left. My boss was a Cranbrook graduate from 1958. So he studied in the era of Eero Saarinen, that kind of gentleman architect, if you will, always with a suit and tie, and very different style of leadership than I think some of us young people were used to. But yeah, get that kid a hamburger. It was just an example of one of those situations where the firm needed the job well enough, but did not prep enough time to put together the presentation drawings, and where some of these charrette drawing techniques came through. I'm going to use a thicker pen for this, so your options might be Pentel sign pen, which they recommend, which a lot of firms still use. A lot of design principals use the Pentel sign pen, including Renzo Piano and others. The Pentel sign pen was designed and built in the 60s so that Japanese executives could do calligraphy really fast. But it's special because it's a bullet tip pen, allows you to do multiple line weights. So very few pens that still do that where a pen can do multiple line weights depending on angle of hold or by pressure, but its felt tip surface does allow for some of that variety. And so it's consequently still very popular with designers for that reason. I think I put into the concept board a photo of one of the design principles of HOK, and it shows him like leaning over the table with a roll of trace and a sign pen. And then you look at some of Renzo Piano's drawings. These beautiful drawings are all sign pen on trace. Richard Rogers, same thing, sign pen on trace. So there's some things that this pen in particular still holds very dear in a lot of designers' minds. The Sanford Sharpie fine point can do it, though, because it's very similar in terms of its felt tip. When it's new, I should say. This one is not new. This one is, the thing about the felt tip pens is that they all wear down, and they change as they wear down and as they dry out. So so those are things you have to keep in mind as these different pens age. But the UDA method recommends using sign pen, but starting with the tree outlines. So on the reference image, you can see all the trees are outlined freehand, no circle template at all, with the intention that there be enough variety in that circle reference to look very organic and natural. But trees at this scale grow together as lines or as masses. So their recommendation is to do a very random, organic look, but not to draw a perfect circle. But that we do the trees first and then buildings second, because the trees are taller than the buildings at this particular view and at this particular scale. But their recommendation is to go in and out and then join in and out with a very loose, scrubby, sketchy line, but then to join several trees together. One thing that folks do like to share is the idea of doing all of the verticals at once, then doing all the horizontals, so you're not constantly turning. It ends up being a little more comfortable on your hand if you can get into the practice of doing all of your verticals at once and then all of your horizontals. So I will do that. I will do all the verticals first. So that way you aren't constantly turning. Can be a little more fluid. Of course, we are using our foam core, so turning the paper is not a situation for you, because if you have this, even if you're working in a high school gym or a Lions Club cafeteria, you have the ability to turn the paper as you wish. But in past situations where we've been taped down onto tables that we may not be familiar with, turning is not an option. But if whatever's most comfortable for you, if you have your little piece of foam core, it's amazing how portable that can be. So I'm doing all my verticals first. I'll do all my horizontals. Bless you. switch line weights and go to the Pilot Fine Liner. Next, I will do all the roof lines. Put as much or as little detail as you wish. You might want to do dormers or cupolas, your choice. Additional elements in the architecture. We're using the thinner line weight for the roof lines. I'm going to put a cupola on this one. And it's just as many gables or dormers as you wish. All those will be visible from this view. And then, with that thin line weight, I'm going to do the block outlines. Underneath those trees. Curb cut into garages. To additional off-street parking. Not doing any sidewalks yet, I'm just doing the block outlines. Those outlines continue underneath the tree cover. Carving in more parking, probably just out of habit. The second overlay front, I'm going to make a tiny little solar diagram, assuming that if north is up, we want our solar diagram to communicate one time of day. The UDA illustrative method, I believe that they suggest a very specific time of day. Which I believe they like, you can see that their shadows are at an angle that suggests that it's approximately 10 or 11 a.m. I think we've followed suit over the years. So I will make a little solar diagram in the corner with the sun pointing a certain direction that might suggest 10 to 11 a.m. That diagram in the corner helps us remember what angle of incidence that the shadows would occur, no matter whether we're working on the back or the front of the paper. So it always helps to make a little solar diagram before you start rendering. I'm going to check now, make sure that I'm going to lift this up and just get a good look at it. Make sure that everything's closed. There's no gaps. And at that point, if all of your shapes are closed, then this could be rendered in Photoshop very easily. If all of your shapes are closed, you can use the paint bucket function and drop paint into this, or use one of the multiple programs available now for the iPad or for Photoshop. So that's ready to render, whether it be a digital method or a traditional method. I just want to lift this up a little bit and check my work and make sure that things are closed up and I haven't missed anything. Add a few more cafe tables. Plenty of cars there. And that's ready to render. So I'll pop that off. Take these away. Flip this over. I'll start with grass green. Willow green or grass green. I'm just going to lay in. This is willow green. I think I'm comfortable with that. This is willow green. I'm just going to lay in some willow green over all of the open areas. Kind of dodge the houses and the garages, but I can cover up the trees just fine. This willow green just makes the lawns recede a bit. Kind of a circular motion. Kind of dodging around the patios and dormers. And I'll shift to either apple green or grass green on the trees. I'll just, again, a circular motion, just reinforce the circular nature of each of those trees with emphasis of color on the shaded side. So the shaded side, the shaded side, the shaded side. So the emphasis of color is on the shaded side, and that starts to make the trees look a little bit rounded. This is a medium green, so this could be apple green or grass green. I'm going to go with some flowering trees in the park. So I'm going to actually shift gears to a pink or a peach for the trees in the park. If we look outdoors, our redbud and our apple blossom and our dogwoods are starting right now this week. And I'll just start some pink on our shrubs. So lots of things blooming this week. Forsythia is yellow flowers, yellow flowered shrub. Beginning of dogwood, tulip tree. Some more allergies ahead for some of us. I've got blueberry. I'll start to add blueberry to these pink flowering trees. Maybe these are red buds or winter king hawthorn. They don't grow up too tall is probably the only problem there. But red buds, we have red buds in all of our boulevards here. So a little bit of blueberry. Maybe these are lilacs. Some of more flowering shrubs. Next, I will use goldenrod for multifamily housing. Residential land use color is pure yellow or lemon yellow. Multifamily is goldenrod to a pale orange. And that's if you want to use standard land use colors in your drawing. That can add sort of a diagrammatic flair to the drawing. Some folks don't elect to do that, but you can. UDA uses the slight modification of the standard land use color system in their book, in their employment book. They flip the colors for special use and industrial in their color scheme. Red is retail, so I'm going to think of this building as a retail building. This could be a coffee shop, restaurant, cafe, ice cream shop, or all three. And in fact, portions of buildings can be communicated so that they show upper floor housing and retail on the ground floor. We do that by mixing the colors like so. So this would indicate retail on the ground floor and then housing above it. It's not the only way to do it, but it is a way to do it. But you can communicate different land uses by combining the colors like that. I'll take a desert tan or a craft brown and do some brick pavers in our common areas. Scrub that in under the trees. A beige or a desert tan will cover some of the sandy areas in our playground up here, and also it'll scrub away any excess colors on your sidewalks. So I just got a beige here, and I'm just going to use that to scrub away some of the green that covered up some of our sidewalk. Add that in for any patios or additional verandas. And then finally, I'll take a 6th ray, and looking at my solar diagram, I will cast a shadow away from the sun. Layer that on top from buildings and from trees. Referring to solar diagram in the corner that determine the angle of the sun casting objects and trees onto the ground. You can also use black for more impact, but this is pretty gentle in that it doesn't cover up too much of your detail, your color. Black can be quite severe. It'll start covering up a lot of your details. So that really gives the illusion of depth. Makes it start to look like it's really starting to pop. Next, I'll grab a few colored pencils. Just at the right be a good variety here. This is where I can get more specific with maybe some brick texture, paving textures. Just really reinforces that look. Similarly, how to what we did in elevation, we can do a grid pattern or a row pattern. Very similar color wash combination of marker and color pencil just to give the simulated look of brick texture. We will do nothing with the asphalt. We want our colors to pop. If we add color gray to the asphalt, what happens is that it starts to muddy up the whole composition. We want our attention and color hierarchy to be on all the other colors we have already competing for attention on the drawing. So we'll leave our asphalt completely white. Take a green and reinforce the shaded side of each tree. Reinforce that illusion of roundedness, or that spherical nature of the tree crown, the tree canopy. So I'll just kind of round that on the shaded side of each tree. Pink or a lilac or purple. I just want to get some punch in these ornamental trees. It really gives good color variety on the drawing. Cafe tables or umbrellas, they might have a noticeable color to them as well. Contrast with other things on the drawing. The shaded side of each roof, I like to give a little bit of extra color to the shaded side of each roof. So that might be a goldenrod or a pale orange. So looking at my solar diagram, I look for the shaded side of each roof. I give a little more color to that shaded side. The shaded side of each roof. And that, again, reinforces this illusion of three-dimensionality. Makes the drawing really pop. Keep working till you're satisfied. You may want some additional green on the lawn just to cover up any gaps. Just sort of blend your marker washes together. Maybe a desire for just a little bit of additional character. The right color combination, you can really almost kid yourself that it's spring as snow falls outside here in April. playground equipment, swings, slides, bridges, fountains or landmarks. You want more depth or shadow? Grab a black or a dark or a black grape. Black grape is a great pencil color for reinforcing sharp shadows or edge shadows. If you just want a little more shadow, black grape is a great color for that. It's in a dark, dark purple part of the palette. It contains just enough purple to communicate with all the yellows and browns, but it also reinforces really dark shadows from buildings and from trees. Great color for enhancing shadows and shaded portions of the drawing. Black grape. And that completes the UDA, Urban Design Associates style illustrative plan for site development.